And a common thread that I sort of see being pulled through all of these is moving into the future while retaining at least some of our agency. And the podcast that Olivier sent, I think, touches on that explicitly in sort of two ways. Like one, there's these sort of warnings of like various ways in which we could lose it in the future. But then the really interesting bit was suggesting that we might have never had it, in the first place. I mean, I think he uses like all these interesting words to describe states and corporations, like creatures, entities, monsters, and so on. And so I don't know, I guess maybe a good point to start the discussion off would be like, in what way is the future that you're proposing, Olivier, in which AI has merged with government, is meaningfully different from all these other things that we've used to export our agency in the past, that the gentleman on the podcast was saying that we've been doing for hundreds of years, so through bureaucracy, or through, say, a religion, etc. In what way is AI meaningfully different than any of these things?
Are you asking me, Damien?
Sure, anyone. I mean, I think that might be the question. Like, in what way is this like a novel challenge? If we've been exporting agency to these sort of human, non-human organizations for so long.
I think something interesting that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but I haven't quite figured that out yet, is the question of transparency and permeability that people seem to have intuitively with AI. And I think it was addressed in a pretty interesting way in the podcast. This idea that somehow, if it comes from human agents in a more direct kind of supply chain, then we have just this, the structural understanding of it that we don't have for something that's algorithmic. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think the idea of superintelligence, the way he frames it in the podcast, is directly going against that, basically. But there's still a question, even in the way he talks about corporations versus states, and AI is potentially one step further away in the direction that corporations are, with responsibility as an agent, right? I think that's something similar. What is scary to people about AI as this superstructure, that we don't even have legal rights for animals, rights and duties, right? So something that is purely algorithmic, who do you ascribe responsibility to, for example?
Yeah, so the question of accountability is definitely one that I think we'll have to come up to later. That's an interesting one. Just in terms of how AI might be different, what I was thinking is it might be different sort of in terms of scale. A lot of the sort of systems or mechanisms that we have set up currently are ones that we could sort of grasp and we could sort of understand. Whereas I think with AI, we're getting into like huge data sets, sort of black box operation stuff that we can't even grasp what's going on, perhaps. That might be something that that might be a little different with AI.
I think the algorithm part is accountability algorithm really important. You guys actually highlighted two very important points. To me, the difference between, to answer Damon's question, the fundamental difference between not having agency with corporation and states, like this story is saying in AI, is that there's a willingness now to let these artificial agents make decisions for ourselves. So, this old trolley problem is a good one. What we're seeing right now, which seems to have happened in Italy, where they had to triage some of the COVID-19 patient in intensive care. I don't know if that's true, but those are the stories that are coming out. It means that eventually we will want some of these systems to make these decisions for us. So there's a willingness that's, I think, stronger than it ever was to sort of de-responsibilize ourselves from these things, or to let machines make these decisions in a certain way. And further, I think to me, the biggest difference in all of this is that we will have to predetermine the value of human beings. That to me is the fundamental fundamental difference. Right now, we're doing it on a case-by-case basis, even though there are triage ways of just ways to triage people in war settings. We still do it on a case-by-case basis. I'm sure that even though you might be, somebody who should not get health, should not get cured or should not get services from the doctors because of X, Y, Z. There might be a lot of exceptions going on because we're talking human beings talking to human beings, but we'll have to predetermine these things, encode them, and encode them. So whether Hamid, myself, or Damien, who has more value, will in a way have to be predetermined if we want machines to make these decisions. So I think we're going one step further. And at that point, where is accountability, right? I mean, is it with the programmer, the manufacturer, society, problems with the coding, hackers? That to me is the fundamental difference, is the predeterministic aspect of all this.
Can I respond to that? So I think it's actually an interesting question here, because you're using the word coding, right? And predetermination. And I'm wondering whether that's actually the most realistic view of how this kind of triage would happen. So right now, my impression is that most AI that is being deployed on the world to actually make decisions in concert with states, so AI that is used by, local and national government, for example, it's not that. I mean, some things are being predetermined explicitly, and there's discussion about them and who gets to decide and all that. But my experience working at a startup that was actually, on the very left-leaning, socially conscious side, and having to decide or having to ask people, okay, so on what basis have we decided that this is positive or negative, for example? People say, oh, it's because this one city said that they wanted it that way, but then there was a discussion. And most things aren't even getting to that level of explicitness. It's just built-in bias from data sets. So for example, in medical decision-making, part of the way you're going to train surgeons in some models is going to train medical AI is by training it on data from surgeons, right? It's like, what's the best practices of whatever people are doing? And then we take that and we improve it for accuracy and all that. But doctors prescribe less pain medication to people of color. They're more likely to, perform negligent acts on poor patients and all that. And all these things go on for endless lists in medicine and government and education. So I think there's an interesting question of applied ethics of, is there ever going to be a point at which all these questions are asked explicitly? I don't know. It's not built into the system by any means to have to think about it, to have someone make a decision that they're responsible for.
Just to build off of that and to maybe tie back directly to the question of agency. Maybe you guys didn't decide whether or not this is pessimistic or optimistic. I don't know. But when the question of responsibility and decision making, the way you put it, Olivier, predetermined decision making, I quite like that, was really being raised with like automated cars, right? It was sort of like this. It was like kind of a heyday for all the trolley problem theorists, because it literally was a trolley problem, right? Like I don't know if you guys did this test. It was really popular. I think it was like one of the most successful crowd-funded, like just philosophical experiments of all time. There was like this quiz, and it was all these scenarios. So like a car is driving down a road and it has to hit an old lady or a child or whatever. And then people, select which one should die. And then they just sort of like found averages. And theoretically, this will be implemented in the way the car's ethical paradigm works. And in the West, people always chose to save the child. And, in East Asian countries like China, for example, people always chose to save the elder, right? And so like, it seems that the way in which we're implementing our own agency into the agency of these machines is already the product of our environments to some degree, right? And so, the podcast raised all these excellent points about like the ways in which we explicitly surrender agency to all of these sort of like tangible entities, like, corporations and states. But like, there's already a degree in which were mediated through, dare I say it, ROEs, at least cultural packages, right?
Does that mean that ROEs are a bit like artificial agents, Damien? They sort of pull agency from us?
Yeah, I mean, I think a better way of putting it would be like, it's like we exercise agency through them, right? So it's less that like we outsource cognition to them. It's more that it's just like part of the cognitive process. Like in the same way that what's a good way of putting it? It's not like the brain is like co-opting blood flow from the body. It's that the blood flow of the body, part of the circulatory system, it just happens to be enmeshed in the brain, et cetera. It's part of the same mechanism.
But is it the other way around? Is it the ROE who's co-opting us into making things, making decisions? Or is it us are extending ourselves into ROEs, or the ROEs are extending themselves into us? I'm not going to give agency to ROEs, but in the sense that once they're created, it's really hard for us to think outside of them, right? That was your point from the very first meeting we had.
For sure, and not maybe to hopefully this isn't too much of a tangent, but I think personifying them is actually very intuitive. Like maybe it doesn't make too much scientific sense to personify them, but I think it makes psychological sense to personify them. Like this was Durkheim's sort of idea of what a concept of God was, for example, was sort of like the name that society gave to worship itself, right? Like in other words, like people have like a concept of the fact that their moral intuitions don't belong to them. Like you can't decide to stop feeling shame. You can't decide to stop feeling pride. And importantly, no one individual is the source of this feeling that you don't have control over. So you sort of just give it a variable name, and then that becomes a sort of like a God figure. Yeah.
So going back to your original question here, is there a difference now between a merged, like three-headed monster in 2070, state corporation and AI as this artificial three-headed monster, and what we're going through today, where we already have sort of downloaded or uploaded our agency into artificial corporations and machines?
I wonder if the difference is just the language that you have to be literate in order to access it. Like I'm reminded of a point that Shinwei made in our algorithms new public intellectuals event last semester, which is that like literacy in just programming languages isn't just like a matter of technical expertise. It's actually like a sociological problem, right? Like if you actually want to understand the things that are dictating the possibilities in your life, you have to know how to code. And this is going to become more and more of a problem. So maybe the difference is the language that people have to learn. Maybe the radical future has to involve, coding being taught in public schools. That might be something to think about.
So I have kind of 2 points that relate to this. I think the first one is relating to coding. I used to have this idea that the problem with, the future of AI and all that was just digital literacy and the gap there, and that if you just taught coding to all the kids, we would actually have more understanding of, governance and what shapes our lives than we do now. But I don't think I agree with that at all anymore. From having spent more time in environments that are actually doing this, where people are highly literate and in AI and coding and all the different technologies, and they're actually making things that take decisions in the world. And that's made me realize the degree to which just coding doesn't give you agency over this at all. Maybe money does. But just knowing how to code, because the first question I was going to ask in relation to what Olivia was saying was, I think an interesting way for me to think about it is through resistance. If you're trying to resist a government in the way that, that this form of superintelligence that we have today, or that we've had for the past few centuries, versus trying to resist an AI kind of superstructure thing, is it just the narrative and the language, as you say, that's different, or is it actually degrees of possibility? Is it possible to resist that kind of AI? And then you get into this sort of like matrix scenario, basically. But yeah, coding doesn't actually tell you any, like coders don't know necessarily what the data they're even working with is. It's the same thing as just being a blind worker. You're on the factory floor, but that doesn't give you an understanding of what's going on in the head office.
Yeah, so I was definitely going to try to make that point as well, Iris. So the idea that understanding how the coding works at the sort of the if statement level, it's not really going to give you an understanding of the superstructure of it and all of the basically all the complex interactions and stuff. Coding, it's a lot of people do sort of just one part of it, and then there are people that focus on the big picture, and then that's sort of the software engineers and stuff like that. I don't think that would be the issue. It would be more if we go there at all, would be more literacy in terms of maybe sort of systems analysis or something like that. But I had another point. Okay, I'll beg off for now, but I'll come back to it.
Okay, I think to me is less a question of understanding the coding than a question of, to answer your question, Iris, I think the resistance is problematic because the sort of new paradigm is not one based on repression, at least for us. It's one based on seduction, right? So it's really hard to resist these extraordinarily seductive technologies and the way they improve our lives. So it's really hard not to use GPS, for example. I mean, it's really hard not to look at your phone when you're waiting in line at the supermarket, especially right now when you actually probably have to wait outside and be distracted. It's really, these things are really difficult. And to me, the question is the following. For a long time in technology, in the history of technology, we've said that using technology which has decreased our ability, has decreased our memory ability, our ability to retain things, because we just don't need to retain hundreds and thousands of lines of this, of that, and the whole Odyssey and great books like this. We don't need to do this. The argument has always been, and I think it's been proven right, that we get more creative by not using brain resources to memorize things and using these same brain resources to be creative and exploring things. But at what point does the seduction of GPS actually impedes us from being creative and exploring? That's just a small analogy here. And I think we had this discussion earlier, I think with John or Jackie. Auto-tune, for example, is it auto-tuning or auto-tune in music is a good example of this. Autocorrect is not there yet because it's very clunky, but it might get there. If you look at GPT-2, right, that software that actually you give it a line and it's going to complete the paragraph, we're getting there slowly, but these things are seductive. They're not going to be, it's not going to be a matrix-like thing where the world is going to be horrible. On the contrary, it's going to be more streaming, more VR, more pleasure, more door-to-door services. And I think we will willingly let go of agency for that because we're already doing it. I am doing it.
So as I understood it, I thought we were talking more at the state level and sort of the policy level. At that level, there could be an analogy with it being seductive with, politicians wanting to streamline things, to have more complex operations offloaded and sort of make things easier that way. I don't think there's as much danger. I mean, if there can be services that are offered through AI that are very, very useful to people, like, for example, if there's, I think on Spotify they do this where they give you the recommendations, or if, for example, we started to create an AI or something that can generate music, like by listening to what you're interested in and then having you give responses and optimizing for your music listening experience. That can be something that people would find very seductive and would definitely want to go with. I don't think it's I don't see an issue with it that much.
Let's go to, that's not my style usually, but let's go to the dystopian scenario here. Let's say we absolutely, completely and totally make this efficient, right? Optimize this at a complete government level. Then you could eventually, because they're already thinking of doing it for, I saw a video recently from a company who's saying, once we have enough data on your retail habit, we'll be able to buy you stuff before you actually want it, right? Because we know that you'll want that share because of things you've been doing, because of all the data we have on you. We don't have that kind of data yet, but it's not impossible to imagine a certain scenario like this. So imagine Hamid, the government doing this. So we have enough data on Canada and Quebec and Montreal to know these are the laws that you all want us to pass eventually. So we're not even going to think about it. We're just going to pass the laws because the data is showing us we want more of this, less of that. That's not completely, it's science fiction, I agree, right? Because I don't think we'll ever let machines sort of do that or governments. But there might be, there might be a slippery slope here where we slowly, in a way, get there. And I think if you want to see some of it, the beginning of some of it, even though it is a good thing, census in a way, are a bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, Olivier, I think this is a great point. Not that I'm an expert or anything, but this doesn't sound like science fiction at all. I mean, it sounds like something that people will be pouring a lot of money into and having a lot of incentive in utilizing it. And I think it's to a large degree. I mean, this is, I was like sort of loosely involved in the NDP, like outreach thing in the 2015 election. So I got to have an inside look at the way these things, at least at what seemed to be the priorities of the party around the time of an election. And it was entirely based around, we could say, tailoring legislature to what they believe people would vote for, right? This is exactly what they're doing. And I think an AI would just be a more sophisticated version of that. It's like you said, like a lot of the stuff seems clunky now. Like recently I flirted with the idea of purchasing a mattress. So I visited a couple of like mattress websites, and now all I get are ads for mattresses, which is inefficient, because I'm not going to have to buy one. But predicting what I will buy in the future, it doesn't seem so far off. And expanding that to electoral politics, I think it's just the next step.
So just an anecdote on mattresses, and then I'll make my point. I was listening to a podcast, and the podcast title is "Why there are so many mattresses stored in the United States?" When how many mattresses do we buy in our lifetime? Not that many. So that was an interesting podcast, and just to reassure you, Damien, meaning you can actually negotiate. These are actually some of the stores where the profit margin is the highest. Most stores need to sell about 3 or 4 mattresses a month just to break even. They make a humongous amount of profit on this. So knowing this, you can maybe, if you haven't bought your mattress yet, you can maybe negotiate this. Okay, I'm closing the bracket here. I'm going to be a bit provocative. Let's just say that these predictive buying pattern and these predictive election patterns or legislative patterns that we're starting to see, is it the end of agency, or is it agency on steroids? Where actually we've created structures who actually can decide what we want. No, not decide, they can actually see what we want, and they can actually actualize our agency.
So this isn't entirely answering the question, but it's a non-AI paradigm that I think helps me at least to think what this might look like, which is benevolent paternalism or nudge theory. Just something that I grapple with on a daily basis, deciding whether this is the worst thing that ever happened to political decision-making or the best one that we absolutely need to implement it. I don't know if everyone's familiar with it or if it's useful for me to kind of explain a little bit.
Explain it a little bit, it is.
Okay, so basically nudge theory is this very, very popular and seductive idea in behavioral economics. And the idea, the reason it's called, I'm pretty sure they call it benevolent paternalism.
By the way, Iris, there's actually a nudge office in the UK government, or a nudge
yes,
government
yeah.
office, yes.
And multiple kind of different, even local government, I think, has gotten involved in that now. So basically the idea in a nudge is that it's you're taking the kind of behavioral architecture of a place. So if you think, for example, of a school cafeteria, a school cafeteria is not designed neutrally. Even if you give someone just the freedom to put things wherever they want, and then the kids go through and they pick, candy versus fruit, it's never neutral in the sense that you're always choosing what kind of real estate to allocate, what kind of attentional real estate to allocate to different things. So, for example, they found, all these classic things, like if you put the fruit at eye level and you put the candy kind of on a high shelf and you have to ask for it, and kids will just have significantly lowered candy consumption, and then they go to the dentist less and they're healthier, and blah, blah. And they've done this successfully at all kinds of different levels, from this kind of thing like a cafeteria to making retirement savings opt out rather than opt in. You have significantly more retirement savings in an entire company, and people don't end up like poor and destitute at the end of their career because they didn't have the foresight to do it for whatever reason. And so the really interesting thing about this is that you get very different affective reactions from people when it's brought up. On the one hand, you have like people I know in that sort of behavioral economic, social entrepreneurship world for whom it's just the best thing ever. It's like, oh, here's a way that is non-intrusive to not make decisions for people, but just nudge them in a direction that is better for them objectively, right? It's this idea that it's objectively it's better, it's more rational for people to have retirement savings, eat less candy, but they can still eat the candy and not save for their retirement if they want to. It's this opt-out versus opt-in mentality. And the question with kind of AI fusing with government for that is, for me, is really a question about nudge theory at its most at its least dystopian, let's say. If you kind of cast out all of the dystopian possibilities and you say, okay, this will be banal, it'll be just like the daily world, slightly different, slightly better, let's say, what might happen? That's something that I wonder about. So if you have a social democratic government in place for 15 years and they've fused with AI, and now, at the supermarket, you have to pay more as a company to sell your candy than you would to sell fresh fruit and vegetables, for example, which is basically the opposite of what it is today. How does that affect people's health? And they can still choose to buy anything they want at the supermarket. Is that a good thing? Is it maximizing your agency? What was the term you used, Olivier? It's actualizing agency.
Agency on steroids.
Yeah, agency. I mean, I like actualizing agency better. I think it's
But the difference with nudge theory, Iris, is that most of it is not that transparent. It's sort of, I'll give you an example. We had a discussion at one point with course evaluation at McGill, at Senate, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it doesn't really matter because I can't remember the detail, but we decided to do this an opt-in instead of an opt-out, or the other way around. Anyway, we used nudge theory. And I remember one economics professor at one of the committees said, I know exactly what you're doing. I'm not going to stand against it, but I know exactly what you're doing. And he was right? We were pushing people. We were actually intentionally pushing people in the direction we wanted them to go, without most of them actually knowing about it.
But the question people often raise is, nudge isn't actually a choice between not influencing people and influencing them. It's a choice between explicitly deciding to influence them in a direction that, you can justify has some good, versus allowing them to just be influenced by their baser instincts, basically. so the instinct for sugar, spending, fat, etc., whatever it is that we think are social ills in the most banal way. And I don't know, the mattress thing is making me think of this as well, in the sense that nuts theory in some ways is just ad optimization, but for what the government thinks is good for you and for, the system more broadly.
Well, the question is for democracy, I think, is optimization, can optimization and democracy actually work together? Or is optimization actually, the decrease of democracy?
Well, I'm going to have a pretty controversial opinion on this, I think. But as I see it, I think that democracy and the focus on autonomy generally in liberal societies is much more important in terms of determining what individuals are allowed to do or not do. In terms of what the collective is allowed to do, you got to pick goals and then optimize for those goals. Otherwise, it is sort of the problem with democracy, where you just get pulled in all different directions, and it's just tyranny of the majority at some point.
So you would optimize more, Hamid, in democracy?
So I think where democracy would come into play is choosing the goals, and we're already sort of doing that by offloading most of our policy and decision making off to representatives, which I think is a good thing, because we can't specialize in everything, and we can't make a sort of, I don't know how it works in Switzerland with their direct democracy. Maybe it is possible if everybody's on board and super well informed. I can't see that being the case in terms of going back to AI, in terms of very, very complicated decisions that involve a lot of technical knowledge. You would have to offload some of that somehow.
Just a quick point about Switzerland. It's interesting. So what they do, just to add some detail, is like they have like referendums all the time. I think it's like 4 to 6 a year or something like that, and it's about like specific policy, like do we want XYZ legislation? Let's have a referendum, etc. And this prevents a lot of corruption, obviously, because there aren't individual politicians drafting legislature independent of the people they're representing having any real decision making, and therefore being able to be swayed by personal career interests, partisanship, whatever. But what comes into play then is that like advertising, political advertising is like huge in Switzerland, right? Because if you want a certain piece of legislation to get drafted, all you have to do is convince people that it's a good idea, right? So I think maybe direct democracy is the dimension in which Olivier's AI as seduction idea would be most manifest. Right? Because it's the version of democracy where advertising has the most sway. It's like permanent election season. You're under constant pressure to go this way or that.
Kind of building off of that, I'm gonna jump in. Can you hear me? Okay. I think something we're gonna see more and more of, like, in regards to this, is an interfacing of new digital publics and AI, especially in terms of like, where do the discussions about democracy take place? Usually it's on these websites like Facebook and weirdly enough Instagram now and Twitter, like these kinds of websites. And what occurs is I feel like the AI, like, I mean, we all know this, like, especially with regards to Trump, like the AI generates content that you think that it thinks you would enjoy in terms of amplifying your own ideologies. And something weird I find is like it's kind of led to an emergence of this like digital publics that are very like political, and this kind of a lot of politicians have tapped into that and like kind of reflecting those ideas in terms of legislation as well. So I think because like ultimately democracy is a project of translation. It's translating what your constituents think into like actual legislation, and like the people within the constituencies, they don't really know like what that process entails. So it really is up to the elected members to like go about translating what they think that they want. So, and then the AI takes that a further step by translating like data into points that might interest the constituents. So I think that there's going to be more and more interfacing of like, I mean, making that process more seamless in a sense. And that kind of worries me, because then you get things like India, like where these digital publics have been like instrumental in like allowing the rise of fascism and like people in the streets, like pogroms all the time. So I think like increasingly it's going to look like that, and it's that I find that quite disturbing.
Could you tell us a little bit more about India, the situation there? I'm not too familiar. Yeah.
I mean, India. I mean, digital spaces are extremely important in India. I mean, as in most places at this point, a lot of exchanges take place on WeChat. A lot of the places in like the so-called third world, like WeChat is extremely important in terms of like disseminating information, just like money transfers, kind of establishing networks of information sharing. So and like those have been like seminal spaces in terms of like solidifying like Modi's reach in terms of like everyday people in a sense. And I mean, Modi's whole platform is ethno-nationalism, return to like a pure India that's like a Hindu state in a sense. So like that's definitely, I mean, like we've all seen the pictures of like like men in the streets, just like rows and rows of men with like weapons off to like destroy and like beat up Muslim communities in India. So like that's I mean, I find like that's kind of a direct consequence of like kind of like the on one hand the consolidation of these like publics that like now more than ever have been able to share information and like regenerate themselves in accordance with like their own beliefs and like the beliefs they see reflected by elected members of government. And then like that like Modi himself like kind of interacting with those people in a sense. So it becomes like a personal relationship that's mediated with like also facilitated by these AIs. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but like I highly suggest like looking into it. Like it's not, I mean, now with coronavirus, like you don't hear about it in the news anymore, but like it's an ongoing situation that I've been kind of following, and I find very interesting in a sense of it's like just such a sudden change. It's like I mean it's like been building, but like this last year especially has really meant like a concretizing of I don't know, this like new violent regime in a sense. And that makes sense. I'm just rambling. Yeah, I'm just afraid we're gonna see that in other places. And like I think like people usually want, I mean, I don't know, on one hand we fear AI, on one hand we kind of worship it. I feel we kind of treat it as a benevolent entity that's going to stand on its own, when like effectively I see it more as like a net, maybe kind of like connecting things and flattening things in a sense. Does that make sense? I don't really know what I'm saying at this point.
Okay, that's flattening idea is interesting, Carmel. So the question is, is AI flattening or is it increasing inequity? That's actually a very interesting question. In certain ways, it certainly is flattening because it gives us access to tools that used to be specialized. GPS being, the easiest, first one that comes to mind, but you could probably say, again, autocorrect, you could say translation software, you could say infinite space on different drives, amazingly fast computers. Those things used to be extreme. It used to be reserved for very specific industries like the military. So is it enabling us to be more creative? And from a personal anecdote, it's so much easier, cheaper, faster, prettier to make a film today than it was when I was your age. It's just easy today. You can, and you can upload it on YouTube for almost nothing as long as you have a computer and a smartphone. Or is it actually increasing inequity? That I think is an interesting question, because it one way or another, it's doing it without much of and it's still doing it in a way a bit outside of our decision-making ability.
I just think, personally, I just think it like amplifies the noise we're capable of making. It doesn't particularly make the noise any prettier. which is ironically kind of the problem of prestige television right now. There's so much good television. You can't physically watch it all. So what effectively happens is that most shows just get canceled. So I feel like it's the same with like the content we generate. There's just so much of it. There's the audience disappears. Like recently, the problem with Instagram during coronavirus, like everyone's in quarantine. So at one point, so many people were having live videos. No one was there to watch them because everyone themselves are just broadcasting. So I just find that so funny. I feel like that's what's occurring right now, like in a much more like subdued sense. But I feel like more and more like it's going to become so noisy out there, and you're just gonna have to just like maybe like on one hand we're gonna just form like more communities in a sense of like there'll be a sharing of what we generate, but like in smaller scale. I think like I don't know, with all this content being generated, not sure.
Okay, good point again, Kondo. Makes me think of this sort of banalisation of the artistic process, right? So it used to be, like, and I'm thinking of my father who, you know, when he was younger in the 1950s, tell me, oh, there's about, I don't know, maybe there were 500, my father was a sculptor, there was 500, you know, known sculpture around the world. And by the time he passed away in the mid 2010, there was, I don't know, gazillions of them all across the world. So is the notion of agency actually related to the notion of the sacred? Is the fact that things that we used to consider important, sacred, mystical, whatever word you want to use, are becoming commodified and easily available and being done by everyone. Film used to be this really, really special thing that just a few people could do. Same with music, same with writing. Now it's all over the place, and your example of YouTube is a good one. Is the loss of agency actually related to a loss of the feeling of the sacred?
John, I not to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you might have thoughts on this, because I can't help but think that there might be a connection between like agency, you know, the sacred, and say skill, right? Like there seems to be like a crucial difference between like learning to play the piano, learning to play like a very complex instrument like a saxophone, versus, you know, messing around with like a synthesizer, or being like a digital DJ. Not that I'm knocking any of those. I'm sure they take a lot of skill, but they seem to have different processes of learning. And so, in other words, if we can't exercise our agency through the practice of skill, then is the sacred something that we lose? That might be a way of formulating the question.
Great question, and probably beyond my intellectual capacity to plunge in depth into, but I'll react to what Olivier was just talking about, in reaction to Kendro talking about the multiplicity of offerings, and Olivier citing your father as an example in terms of numbers of sculptors. The part of this that seems interesting to me is curation. That when we had critics, or when culture was consumed, let's say in museums or in concert halls, someone decided what was good. And then we went and consumed it. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, good. Then we went and we consumed it. Now, that's not terribly democratic in terms of accessibility, or even in terms of making the product available for us democratically to make a decision about its relative value. And now I'll go to Damien, where you were talking about skill, and we'll compare so-called art music or classical music with popular music. Now, that dichotomy didn't exist in Mozart's time, but it certainly does today. And one might say, one could argue, I'm not making this argument, one could say that acquiring beats online and then rapping on top of it requires less skill than I had to acquire to become an opera singer, or so-and-so did to become a wonderful pianist. Does it make one art form better than the other? And what is going to be our judgment call around that? Sales? Number of hits on YouTube or whatever is the site. Now, the challenge for me is one around if we have accessibility, but there is no curation, how do we as a group refine our sensibilities? That's a function that critics provided for me when I was reading Andrew Porter in the New Yorker magazine, who had about 15 pages to review an opera. 15 pages. I mean, we no longer have reviews at all, but even when we had them, they were reduced to 500 words, and you could barely get what happened and when and who wrote it and who was in it. And then you might get a paragraph what was really good. With Andrew Porter, he would frequently begin with the Greeks. A review for his performance that he saw at the Met last week began with the institution of theater. But reading those articles over a couple of years was like taking a master's degree in music. Okay. Now, what does that do? In my case, it refined my sensibility. It didn't close me down in terms of saying, this is good, that's not good, but it helped refine my tools of acquisition to understand what I was listening to, and it gave me a frame of reference. I think that that's what we lose with this incredibly broad access, where, as Kando was just laying out, there's so much TV created that really, really good things disappear because not enough people get to see them. I would rather have a curated list, whether it's from my friends saying, oh, what's best on Netflix, go see this. I would rather have some kind of curated list so I don't waste my time checking things out that aren't of interest, or worse, missing things that would be wonderful. And last point, and I know this is a ramble, but you asked, last point, the last thing I want is AI suggesting a list of things that I am going to like based on what I've listened to or watched in the past. That prevents me from discovering something new that's outside my ken, that's outside my frame of reference that I might find wonderful. I want some kind of curated list, I guess, by people I respect, whether they're friends or they have a reputation, which is going to say, this sounds like the craziest thing in the world, but you got to look at this. You got to listen to this because it's wonderful for all these reasons. Does that answer anybody's question or thought?
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in here. This is a bit of a tangent, but in terms of curating lists, I would say that the research on affective forecasting, which is basically research on predicting how you would emotionally react to something that you encounter in the future, it shows that basically the best way to find out how you'd emotionally react to something or how you'd enjoy something is to ask people who are similar to you and who have undergone it. So in that sense, maybe the sort of Rotten Tomatoes or those kind of reviews, those are actually fairly indicative of how people would react. But that is, of course, bypassing the issue of novelty, as you mentioned, and of increasing sensibilities, which, once you have increased sensibility to a certain stage, you can enjoy it in a different way. And that's also something. But yeah, that is a bit of a tangent.
Okay, let me continue being provocative here, John. So as Iris made the point, and it was a very good point, that AI is just often reproduces our own biases, right? But we have biases, and it is possible to imagine a future where we actually can go back, because that's been done recently. You can go back to these databases and try to diminish what we didn't know were biases in our behavior, and make the database and make the program, the AI program, a bit more objective in what it's trying to do. We're not there yet, but at least there's a way to get to the data, which is really difficult with human beings. We're black boxes of prejudices and biases, and most of them we don't even know we have. So let's imagine an AI that actually could judge music, and I'm going to go even further, that could actually award prizes in art and literature and music and film based on very specific criteria that we would have decided are the most important ones. And this without being sexist or racist, or not taking into account different types of work because they're made by people who do not look like the jury, right? So most juries, at least in literature, in my limited knowledge, most juries in literature, most juries in filmmaking are still, people like us. Still, there's very little diversity in what I've seen so far in awards. I think the Nobel laureates are still being given by very white Swedish people, right? It's not the country that's known for its most for the most diversity. So could we imagine having actually an AI that could read all of the books that are being published in a year everywhere in the world and decide, according to these 2000 criteria, Amid's book is by far the best? Hopefully you'll get there, Amid. So John, what would you think about that? The question is to you. I'm trying to get you to have a heart attack, I think.
No, not in the least. I'm more relaxed than ever now that I'm not doing anything but here thinking and listening and reading more than ever. I don't have any trouble with what you're proposing, as long as it's not prescriptive. So if it becomes a list that I consult, and ideally, and this is the time for it, I don't even need to go, and we'll use books as an example, buy the top 10 books to see if I like them, but I can sample them now. I can read a few paragraphs. And I don't mind lists. And Amit, your comment on lists that are curated by previous intention actually being helpful, yes, and that's why often groups of friends who recommend things to me, I will try, and they might be more or less successful. I think all that I am concerned about is when AI becomes prescriptive and limits the availability to me of the outlier. Does that answer your question, Olivier?
Yes, it does, but I think the danger is that AI always becomes prescriptive. I mean,
exactly. And to go back to Runciman's podcast that you assigned as homework, because a lot of this discussion is clear to you all, is new to me. What I found fascinating was separating agency away from the technology of AI and looking at the place of the state, of this place of government, and the home of agency. And I'll go a step further in Javid's film recommendation, which I spent a few minutes looking at, talking about the establishment of the corporation as a way of limiting responsibility, right? Limiting individual responsibility. And what a lot of this discussion ends up poking in me, with this background that I have that you might have forgotten about in theology and in philosophy, and which as a consumer, as a person living in society today, drives me nuts, is the fact that there is no responsibility in corporations, let's say, for Monsanto, right? Killing people. I want a few of those executives to be taken out and shot, okay? That'll get everybody else's attention, the goal. So as I look at AI and technology and the downloading that we've referred to this morning of responsibility for creating, let's say, legislation, my concern becomes one of responsibility, our own responsibility to become informed so that we can decide if something is worthwhile or not. And also the responsibility, if we're going to download the responsibility for legislation to legislators, that they somehow be accountable, at least in a vote. But if what is taking place is an opportunity for folks to get ahead at everyone else's expense, I want there to be responsibility for that. So if you can help me, never mind if it's today or in our process, unpack a little bit further what I think Olivier was bringing us to in looking at this podcast, listening to this podcast, is somehow sorting out AI, agency, and responsibility. That's the place that I find interesting. And I think, Iris, I think you were also getting to that today, and I found that, and Kando, quite interesting. I've said before, I'm not an intellectual.
Yeah, so I would love to jump in on here. So this is something that I wanted to bring up in the sort of our beginning of the conversation about accountability. So in the podcast with Runciman, the professor from Cambridge, essentially there were a few things there that he said that I really wanted to touch on. One was the idea that, separating basically agency from decision making. So the idea is that mechanisms are sort of decision making tools that we exercise our agency through, but they're not themselves agents. And then there was this idea that he had where it was like he gave the example of the state deciding to go to war and saying it's really the state that makes a decision, it's not people. And in a sense, that's true. You know, you are using the mechanism of the state, and through that complex mechanism, you're coming to this conclusion. There's a lot of things that you can trace back to people, though, and I think at every step of the way, you can trace it back to people. Here's sort of, and I'm going to try to keep this brief and not ramble, but I think this is important to get to. So just broadly speaking about mechanisms, there's sort of the pre-implementation stage where you're designing it. You have to, first of all, identify what goal you wanted to achieve. You have to design it. You have to model it, see if it works in theory. You have to prototype and test it, right? So that's just before you even start building or making it. That's lots and lots of steps where if you don't do your due diligence, we can hold you accountable, and we should. Then there is, implementation. You have to actually assemble the mechanism. You gotta, if humans are part of it, like in government, for example, you gotta train them. You have to, make sure that they have experience. They have to fulfill the role effectively, meaning once they're going through that, you gotta have some oversight, like regulatory and supervisory mechanisms for it. If it's, a lot of these mechanisms come about because we have some other mechanism working, like government that builds something new or puts in place some new mechanism, right? Well, if this new mechanism goes awry and it's because of an old mechanism, we got to look at the old mechanism and see, what let it do that. And, that's just the implementation part. After implementation, there's still quality control to see if it's working properly. You got to modify it if it's necessary. You got to constantly observe it, test it, keep training people. There's a lot of responsibilities here that, basically, it's not like this mechanism is something that you build and then put out in the world and then it's its own thing. It owns its own decisions, as Runciman puts. No, it's something that we put into motion. So you got to look at that. It's something that there's a lot of due diligence in maintaining it and in continuing to have function. There's a lot of places where we could lay blame.
So to your point, do you guys know about high frequency trading? So I'm not Damien, do you know about this?
No, I was just going to prompt you to fill us in, of course.
Okay, so I'm not a financial expert, unfortunately, because I'd be much wealthier if I were. But I was I don't know why, but I found this thing and I read a couple of books on it. It was really hard for me to try to figure this one out because they use. Actually, I'm going to send you a couple of things because it's really interesting. You're trying to understand this financial world and have they really have the very specific lingo which prohibits you from understanding most of what's going on, right? And of course, these things are very high stakes because we're talking about money. So in a nutshell, high frequency trading, what is it? It's in the, we're talking millions of seconds, microseconds, I think they're called, the millions of seconds, between when you actually make an offer and the offer is accepted or bought or put on the trade market. And between these little microseconds, high frequency trading is the lower, it's the increase it's the lower the increase the asking price and lower the buying price, or the other way around. Anyway, in these microseconds, what these softwares do is they manipulate the asking and the selling price. They trade and they trade and they sell at a very quick pace, and they make a couple of cents on each trade. But of course, we're talking here hundreds of billions of dollars that are being spent on this. And what's really interesting is that this actually has a physical property. That means they need to be as close as possible to the actual computer who does that. That's why a lot of the trade markets now are not what you see on floors of trade markets. This is all a fiction now. It's all being based on computers in different cloud storage. So they actually pay to be physically as close to the actual motherboard. And they actually pay to have extraordinarily fast connection to that computer, because the millions of seconds, the difference between Damien's software and mine, actually, we're talking about billions of dollars. But of course, these things are completely without human control. Yes, the software has been created by human beings, but they're much too fast for us to control anything. And they're gravely changing the stock market, because now a lot of the transaction and billions of dollars are being exchanged, but none of it is based on a company's actual value. Because in theory, when you invest in a company, is that you've done your due diligence and you think that Apple is better than Microsoft and it's got a better management and better this and better that. You're investing in that company. So it has nothing to do with that. It's really a fascinating transformation of our financial world, where human beings have created the software. They sort of go back to Iris, they're sort of nudged the software in a certain direction, and we've completely lost control. And there's been a couple of crashes created by these things where we actually have no idea what actually happened, where prices have increased by 1,000-fold in a couple of minutes, to 3 minutes and 10 minutes, and then gone back to normal, and nobody really knows what's going on here. So that's an interesting use of agency, or the absence of agency. On the other hand, if you do it well, then you increase everybody's wealth, because you're creating wealth out of nothing, out of the gazillion number of 1 to 2 cent trade, which makes money for everyone. It's worth looking at the article. There's actually this whole story. I'm going to try to find the book for you. The whole story is actually, the people who actually discovered this and made this a sort of a mini scandal were actually people from the Royal Bank of Canada. They were like the heroes of that story. Let me try to find the book for you guys.
So I mean, that's an excellent example, and I think Runciman sort of mentioned in brief that one of the types of corporations is sort of limited liability corporations. Sort of these ideas that you have, once you have this kind of mechanism going, you offload some of the responsibility from people. It's no longer individuals responsible for it. It's sort of the mechanism itself that owns the decision. That's what I don't buy. So if we have, let's say, these machines that are being built, and then they're gaming the market in this particular way and creating wealth, or crashing the market in some cases, it's not the case that we just look at the machine, it's like, bad machine, you did bad. It's, you can't hold the machine responsible, obviously, and you also shouldn't, because the machine is just, it's just a mechanism that somebody put into play. Now, as I mentioned, with all those different steps at which you have to make this mechanism and you have to do your due diligence, it means that you got to look after who's implementing the system and who designed it, and did everybody do their due diligence. If we find that everybody did, they followed all the precautions, they looked for anything that they could reasonably foresee as problems, and you didn't foresee this, fine. Okay, nobody's to blame, but you still have to fix it later. You don't keep running the system as it is and keep crashing it. But if you do find that somebody was cutting corners, or was self-interested, sort of rent-seeking, so to speak, then we have laws for that.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Ahmed. I'm not convinced it's so simple though. So I mean, what I see is the difference between, say, like a government, I don't know, deciding to build a dam, right? Like a giant hydroelectric dam. It's like obviously the dam functions in a way that is, you could say, like beyond any particular functioning of any individual person, right? Like, and that's why we have to build it, because we can't generate hydroelectric power with our hands or with tools that we can hold individually and whatever, right? So if the dam happens to collapse, right, then it's obviously, I mean, where is the responsibility going to fall? Well, where did the error happen? Was it the people who decided where the dam was going to be in the river? Was there, corruption in the people who decided to make the policy that allowed it to happen? Is it the construction people? Did they use the wrong kind of concrete, whatever? Like that's the sort of question that I think you're raising. The reason why I think AI is meaningfully different is because, there's well, I think at least there's a meaningful difference between something like a hydroelectric dam and a technology we use to make decisions for us, right? So, let's go to a point Iris was making about, like, say, doctors, right? So it's disturbing to hear, Iris, that, doctors are, we could say having, they're less attentive to their poor patients. I wasn't aware of that. Another example of that, which I find, kind of depressing, is that the average length of sentences given to convicted criminals, it becomes longer the later in the day that you're prosecuted, because judges actually get physically tired, right? So that's a little psychological bug in the system, which might be fixed through an implementation of like an AI prosecutor or something like that. That's the sort of possibilities that I think we're really tackling here. And so when the actual process of decision making is conducted by a non-human actor, that's where the difficulty arises. I think if what we're implementing is basically just some sort of very, very complex infrastructure, then we can rely on the legal structures that we have now. That those seem to be separate questions.
So this is exactly where the idea of agency versus decision making comes in. So the idea is that when you make one of these decision making mechanisms, it's not an agent that makes its own decision. Basically, it's following whatever program or however you trained it. If it's like an AI that you have to train or something, it's doing basically what you made it do. It's you can't say that it's completely different, because it's the same in that let's say when you build a dam, it's going to behave predictably usually, but if you build something that's unpredictable, even if it makes decisions. So first of all, building a dam does make decisions, by the way. The dam is a technology that makes decisions. It makes the action of raising or lowering the water, sometimes automatically, sometimes with somebody's input. But that's
right.
sort of part of the
Sorry
system.
to jump in. I mean just very explicitly, like the dam it doesn't have a little screen where text appears and tells you what a decent policy decision is. You see what I mean? Like the function of the dam isn't explicitly to inform us as to our future actions. Like obviously it affords us future actions, like using all this electricity and so on. Now we can turn our televisions on because the dam is allowing us to make that choice. But like the explicit function of the dam isn't to make choices for us. You see what I mean?
So how's the eye, for example, different in kind from the example you mentioned of judges?
Right. I mean, so the reason why I think that the question of agency, and please anyone, I feel like I'm monopolizing too much time, so please anyone jump in. But the reason why I think AI seems to be a meaningful step, towards the sort of thing, or even why, to Runciman's point, why a state is meaningfully different, if we're willing to personify a state as an entity, why a state is meaningfully different from a dam, is because we export our agency to this imaginary fiction AI thing and the state in a different way than we do these other sorts of technologies, right? it's sort of up to us how we want to interact with the dam, right? When we outsource our decision-making processes to some sort of external entity, I think that's a totally different question, right? I mean, if, for example, we have AI judges, right, then we can imagine a scenario in which, you know, the bug in the AI judge can only be judged by a more sophisticated AI judge without that bug, right? Like, these are the sort of problems that I think will come up.
So this isn't, again, entirely answering the question, but it's something I've been thinking about, and I'm curious what all of you will have to say about it. The question of, I guess, the intersection of agency and decision making and expertise and skill and responsibility, like basically everything that we're talking about, I think comes to a very interesting point in, again, medical decision making. Not the question of bias so much as the question of paternalism. So I've been very interested in placebo in medicine lately, basically. And I think I've talked about this a little bit with some of you. So some of, how can I put this? Basically, there are different cultural norms around the world for the degree of paternalism that we accept. I mean, paternalism in itself is a complex term, but the degree of authority that we accept from medical practitioners, right? And so, for example, something that is well known is that in France and in most of Europe, even pharmacists will prescribe placebos just, you know, widely, or doctors will prescribe placebos for all sorts of different ills. And this is something that in the US, even though people do it, is very hush-hush, right? And then in the US, you have this legal culture that supposedly prizes transparency and all that, even though we somehow don't have that for corporations, but we do for doctors. And there's an interesting kind of divide on the political spectrum, where on the one hand, you have, you know, like kind of the right-wing stereotype of, oh, the state, like, can't just take my money and do whatever it wants with it, so I need to know, blah, blah. Then the other hand, you have things like what I brought up with medical bias and Black patients getting less pain medicine, and so we need more transparency so that we can prevent doctors from having the power to do this. But then in medical decision-making, in the US, for example, when you have patients sign consent forms for everything, there's a huge amount of basically just magic healing, which is what we call, like, scientifically call placebo, that doesn't happen when you do that, right? Like, a lot of the reason that medical doctors are better at healing people, partly because of expertise and partly because they have this authority. The more you hurt this kind of authority, the more many kinds of ills actually no longer have much of a cure. And so there's really interesting questions there, both about expertise and about just the benefits of putting belief and authority into these figures, whether that's like the state or medicine or experts. And what I wonder is whether maybe the solution to all this is just, it's not a one size fits all. It's domain specific. There's certain areas of medicine, for example, where we need less transparency and more of this kind of, trying to remember again what the term you used, Olivier, was, but this kind of actualizing agency, either through AI or through other kinds of superintelligence, like just a doctor in a lab coat that we don't understand, who's using lots of fancy terminology. But do we need that, for example, when it comes to passing laws about electoral practices? You know, where do we need a referendum and where do we need to have experts? And is it something, is the answer something kind of generalized, or is it very specific? I'm not sure. I'm curious what you think of that.
So one initial thought here is that, you know, in the case of placebo, it's kind of a special one, where the lack of transparency is part of why it works, right?
Oh, sorry, just to jump in very, very quickly, something interesting. A counterintuitive fact about placebos is that even if you know it's a placebo, as long as you recognize the authority of the person giving it to you, it will produce the same effect. So that we could say that the lack of transparency, knowing that it's a placebo is only a negative if that diminishes your trust in the agent administering it. Okay, but
Just
Yeah.
to respond to that real quick, if you think though about the kind of culture in which it would be, like in France, for example, you're not going to know in the first place, which is a problem for responsibility, but that's also because there's more trust in doctors. In the US, if there isn't, it's a looping effect, right? You can't really separate them in the real world. But I mean, go on.
Yeah, for sure. No, the point about that was just like, as you mentioned, it's going to be domain specific. But I think there's a significant difference to be made between transparency to, let's say, the people directly affected by it, or to the individual on the street, versus transparency to regulatory processes. For example, the legal system or government, or ultimately the citizens through government and whatever other systems there. So what I'm thinking here is, let's take the example of placebos. If a doctor just starts, giving sugar pills to everybody, even for things that they should not be giving sugar pills, and things start going wrong, maybe they should have the prerogative to prescribe those pills to patients, and patients not to know that they're sugar pills. That's a separate debate, sort of, about placebos more generally. But there is definitely got to be transparency in terms of regulatory oversight, and in terms of ultimately the public's oversight of the regulatory oversight, sort of who's watching the watchers kind of deal.
Okay, well, okay, we're almost out of time here. That was actually fascinating as usual. One my question, but I'm not gonna say much about it, is what's going to happen when we'll have in the future we'll have a good bimodal system where humans will base their decision on AI's data. I wonder how much we'll be able to go against a recommendation from the AI, and how much responsibility at that point will fall on you if you decide that, no, I don't think that's the right decision, and you actually made a mistake by going against the AI. That's going to be an interesting, because that probably will happen eventually. But we do have another little, because we're full of projects, especially now that there's nothing else to do but think about projects. Damien and I have this little interesting project. I'll say a word or two on it, and I'll let Damien, who's he's a world champion in being able to summarize ideas in an interesting way. So the idea here was that while this is an absolutely bizarre time, it's also, as usual, a very interesting time, and in my typical silver lining kind of way. I'm thinking, well, for many, 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 many years, your generation, Amit, Kondo, Iris, Damien, your generation has been worried about where the environment is going, has thought about a new sort of capitalism that wouldn't be based exclusively on growth and destruction, but could be based in another way. And I was thinking, well, there we are. We're actually living this experiment for the first time in the history of humanity, where everything is stopped. The environment is, of course, probably improving. We have to think differently about growth and about capitalism. And I think it would be really, really, really a loss if we're not looking at this period and thinking about a potential new model by looking at what's going on right now. Damien, do you want to add a couple of things here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Olivier. I mean, I think that's already a world champion summary there. Really not too much to add. I think that another way of putting this is that, I think I'm no economist, but it seems that one of the fundamental ways in which the status quo operates, by the status quo I mean our economic status quo, capitalism operates is through crisis, right? And the constant depletion of resources, expansion of sites of extraction, and so on. You move from one site to the next, and that's how economic growth is sustained. What we're in now is a unique scenario in that none of the resources have actually been depleted. It's just that labor has stopped. And that's why the economy is crashing. And I see there's sort of two interesting effects. The first maybe kind of reveals my political biases, in that it's interesting that we've been reminded of the fact that all the value is just produced by labor, right? In other words, that it doesn't so much matter who owns the resources. If no one is actually working to produce the value, then there's no value whatsoever. So that's the first sort of shock to the status quo that I think we can do something very interesting in. I think what's effectively happening now is a kind of a global general strike, right? And if we've been paying attention to any of the sort of, cultural critics of our time.
Mandated by the government, as you said earlier in your
That's
text.
right, yeah. The picket line is enforced by our own governments. That's what a quarantine is, right? Which is pretty interesting. And ironic, right? Everything's flipped on its head. Now the government is telling us not to cross the picket line, and everyone's yelling about getting back to work, especially the conservatives, which isn't that great, the conservatives yelling at us to cross the picket line. But yeah, I think if we've been paying attention to the general line of dialogue from our the cultural critics of our time right now, interestingly, especially ones in Italy, there's a general cry that we don't have to return to the new normal. In other words, we don't have to look at this as, say, like a blip to which the median distribution will return. We can actually look at this as a sort of destabilization that can return to a new point in time, right? And so, I guess the strong way of putting it is that what Olivier and I are discussing is that maybe it's our responsibility to, to return to the discussion, insert our agency into that process, right? In other words, it's like, here we are sort of in a moment of destability in which new possibilities are obvious, like, hey, we can work from home. All those meetings could have been emails and so on. And we can decide what to do about it. So I guess what we're curious about is what you think we should and can be doing about it. What does this reveal? What should we be returning to? That seems to be the question.
Could I ask that you actually share some of the things you've been reading on this? Because I don't feel like I've read very much interesting kind of like future-oriented commentary on this. So it would be really, really great to see that.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we're thinking of doing, Olivier, is this like starting with first, are you guys interested in this? Should we be thinking of this as an extension of the Radical Futures Project with the same group, possibly new members? Yeah, that's great.
Because it reminded me of the discussion I had with you, Damien and Kanto, about 6-8 weeks ago on the side of the, we were standing up during a potluck, and we talked about this what would a new capitalism look like? And I think we're in the middle of it. This is a once in a lifetime worldwide experiment that we're forced to go through. And it'd really be a waste if we don't try to extract from this thing a new model. I'm usually an optimist. I don't think optimistically on this one, I don't think things will change in 3 months from now. I think actually we'll go back to things the way they were, because I think it's going to take more than 3 months to change 50 years, all the post-war period, 70 years of a certain way of doing things. On the other hand, here we are. We have this extraordinary experiment. We should be able to extract new ways of thinking outside what Damien and I discussed, that inventing a paradigm that's not just the left versus right kind of paradigm, capitalism versus communism and all its derivatives. Is there a new way to think about this? Is there a new way to think about growth without destruction? Growth can also, growth that would mean growth in the number of wild and, green spaces, growth in the number of protected species, growth in the amount of social justice we have, and also, growth in riches and intellectual possibilities and things we see, and not just an impoverishment, but growth in the positive sense. So, of course, we're not going to be able to do this ourselves, and we want to continue doing this. But that would mean a bit of a rejigging of Radical Futures. I'm wondering if you guys are interested, and if you are, you should suggest names, because we probably need one or two economists here, at least people who know about these things a bit better than I do. So, Kondo, John, Amit, Iris, any thoughts?
Yeah. So if I can just quickly jump in, I know we don't have much time to discuss it at the moment, and we'd have to think about it independently. What I do think that this is a great opportunity for is to see, you know, uh, basically, social life is very, very different at the moment. It's been affected in sort of many, many different ways, and that would be a great opportunity to see, you know, are there any sort of benefits that of any sort of ways that we're organizing ourselves now that have better outcomes and things that we might be able to keep later on. But I would also caution to say, you know, if we're looking at changing to a new status quo, a not huge change for very good reasons that we can get into later on, and B, let's also take into account what was going well before, and sort of see what's going well now, what's going well forward, and see what should be kept from both.
So I guess this is you all agree, I guess, from this sounds okay, great. So what we'll do, Damien, is Damien and I guess we'll work on this a bit more this week, right, Damien? And then we can probably send you some sort of document and some sort of a couple of questions to start working on this next week. Maybe assign work by next week, not work in the sense of what area would you like to delve into that's of interest to you, that is is changing. And I take Amit's point. I mean, there's a lot of things that were going well. The point is not I'm sorry to make this facetious easy joke, but the point is not to throw the baby with the bathwater, but we actually have to throw the bathwater. Right, we can't keep both. So let's make sure we keep what's good, but we think about different ways of doing things right now. Not just a mode of crisis. That's what I want to do. This has to be a mode of creativity and passion, and using this as a jumping board for things that could be better in the future, and not just go back 3 months or 6 months, a year from now, just the way things were.
Yeah, so just thanks, Olivier. Just I was just telling Iris in the chat that Olivier and I've been working on the draft of like a little synopsis, like something that can describe the project. And like I'm mindful in asking you to reach out to people you have esteem for. It's a lot easier if you have like a summary of the project. So we'll be sending that out to you guys pretty soon, and hopefully you find it useful.
And once we have some sort of a, because we're still back and forth, Damien and I, on this one, but once we have some sort of agreement, we'll send it to you. And feel free to modify it. Well, again, that would, to me, would be the first step of moving this thing forward, is a bit less top down. For thinking
Yes,
about these
that's
things, right? And we do this together and find a way. So we'll do that in the next couple of 3-4 days. Damien and I will send it to you, and maybe with a couple of ideas of how do we start thinking about this for next week. Sounds good?
Perfect. That sounds great. I think we have 2 of the regular Radical Futures lectures left. John and Iris, do you guys want to duel over who goes next?
Or do you want to go directly to the new capitalism, or whatever we're going to call it?
I really don't think I have something to offer in terms of an official presentation. I'm sorry,
No,
but
that's
that's
totally fair.
just where I am. Thank you.
So I think the same. I don't think I have anything that I would feel it would be useful to present right now, but I do have topics that I would love to be able to kind of see what everyone thinks about, and to suggest resources. So I could lead a discussion the way you did today, Olivier, potentially.
I'm all for leading discussions. It's more than the lecture kind of thing. I've been told the last 20 years that lectures were evil, and they were the worst thing after Stalin and Hitler. Just below this. So I'm all for discussion. Do you want to do this?
Great.
Do you want to do half next week? We could do half of this thing about new capitalism and half about your discussions.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Actually, since we're all here, can I just poll you real quick? Because there are kind of 2 main areas I'd be interested in taking this. I think one we've talked about more, and it's medicine, the future of medicine, psychiatry, the brain, all that. And the other is pedagogy, which is probably what I initially would have talked about, but I actually have less already that I don't know, it's not as clear to me, but it would be even more useful to kind of hear everyone's thoughts on it. So do any of you have a preference between those two?
I don't have a preference. I would love to hear your thoughts on both, or I would love to share in a conversation led by you on both of those issues.
Okay, thank you.
So just we have 2 more lectures left, but that was before everything was stopped. So no one is going anywhere anytime soon.
Right.
So at least till early May, and probably going to be till early June, and who knows if we'll be able. We probably won't be able to travel this summer. So I'm all for moving forward with this thing for more meetings until we get a bit tired and need a break. So if you guys are okay with this, it doesn't mean we have just 2 left. We have plenty of them left. All right, good. Okay, so half and half.
Excellent.
We'll do like cream and coffee. It is for next week. We'll do half and half. And Damien and I will send you a couple of things. If you have some things you want us to read ahead of time, Iris, feel free to send them to the group. All right, great. Thank you, everyone. That was amazing. Damien, can you stay on Zoom for a couple of minutes?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Boom, 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 boom. Everybody goes. Feels like Star Trek.
Right.
Iris's teletransporter is not working.
Not beaming up.
So how do we do with the text, Damien? What's the next step with this?
With the text?
Yeah.
I think it's nearly ready.
Okay.
Yeah, so your edits are fine. I think that you're right. The paragraph that I added has maybe a little too many America-centric observations, especially in like the sudden reliance on bureaucracy. Like in Sweden, they're doing the totally opposite thing, and so that's not an international comment. That's an American comment. So I think we can probably dispense with that. I think maybe what I might, I've been working on it a little bit, I'll send it to you later today, is what we might want to add is just a couple notes of possible formats,
Yes.
what we're going to be looking for from people. Like I know
Right.
my first question whenever I get a job is, what exactly do you want me to do? So we might suggest that, and then maybe we can send some of the suggested readings with the first text. I have some in mind, just like articles that have been published recently, some of those links. Yeah.
So should we give ourselves an objective for once, like a concrete objectives in a sense of by September we should start writing a paper on this? So we have concrete things actually we're going to come out of this.
Yeah, and not just like we'll record them and then we'll do something interesting with the audio,
Right.
which is fine. Like I'm very optimistic
Right.
about the current project, but that's just like a lot of work that has to be done retroactively. Yeah, I mean, do you have formats in mind? Like one that is attractive to me, but is maybe a little too conventional for your taste, is just having a sort of anthology where each individual writes one article, they're compiled together, they're produced as a little volume. I quite like that format, but.
Yes, me too. But I see a couple of obstacles to this. First of all, I don't know how many of in our group will actually be able to or will want to do this.
Sure.
My second experience of a collection of articles on a topic is essentially people will do whatever they want to do, no matter what the topic is, right? So you sort of lose a bit of the thread there.
Sure.
I'd be more willing to actually write a common article together, all of us. One.
Really?
Yeah.
A collective article. Okay.
Yeah, a bit like science. We all sign it. We have debates and discussion on it. I'm not usually for those traditional means, but here it's a form that we all control very well. And because the thought will be hard to get our minds around. Let's use a platform we can control at that point. And then, we don't need to explain what we want to do when we're all writing an article. We understand.
Right. Yeah, I can see. Unless we get like stuck down in a real kind of bog about like a disagreement or so on.
Then we'll have a minority report. Why don't we do that? Like
a minority report.
No,
yeah, sure.
No, I'm serious. Like the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So how does that work? So I don't know. So is that where there's two papers or?
Yeah, the Supreme Court. There's the majority decision, who writes it, and there's the minority decision. So people say, I didn't vote for this because the Supreme Court, because of this, that, even though the majority is moving forward. So they explain their decisions. And I think we should, if we have a disagreement, let's do that. That makes it even more interesting.
Perfect. And what do you think we'd be doing with this paper? Like we'd put it up on the B21 website?
No, I think we would try to publish it.
Oh, exciting.
I'm serious about this because I want this to have some sort of an impact. Not just, and it's going to force us, it's going to focus our minds.
Excellent. Okay. When it comes to what the paper will be saying, how top down do you want to be? Like, should we be deciding on the thesis collectively, or should we decide on it and kind of just pick people's brains as to how the argument's going to go?
I think we should do it collectively.
Okay.
That's the whole point of thinking differently about this paradigm, right?
Excellent.
Because I have ideas, but again, if we want to do this collectively, I think my only sort of condition would be my only condition is that it cannot be the same type of paradigm. Either we choose free markets or social democracy, and it has to be something new.
I mean, that might be the thesis itself.
Right.
I mean, less so a thesis of here's a new paradigm and why we need it. It might be here's why we need a new paradigm. Like here's why what we have right now doesn't work. Like I read this one article. It's quite short. I think it's in one of the links that I put in the document. It was like a pun on Fukuyama is like the end of history, where it's like coronavirus is the end of the end of history, right? I think like that's at least, no matter what the topic of the article is, that has to be the first paragraph. Like that's the first premise is like what we have now is not the culmination of historical circumstances, right? Like it's not an ultimate culmination. Like if anything, it has to be the starting point, and that's been revealed to us by how contingent everything is through this phenomenon. Bats get a disease in Wuhan, and now playgrounds are closed in Montreal, right? Like that's not something that we can ignore,
You're right, but my only fear is that there'll be some that's sort of where because I can see push to just, it'll be hard not to always go back to the typical paradigm. Saying more governmental more governmental intervention. Not that I'm against it, but that's still part of the same old paradigm: big government versus private sector. This is essentially what we're hearing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the coronavirus has shown that whatever except maybe for the U.S. and we still don't know because there's a lot of potential. But it seems that every medical care system has had its challenges, no matter whether you're left or right. So that's my only fear is, and I know it'll be impossible not to pick up some bits and pieces from both systems, but I don't want, social democracy or free market as the solution to this new thing.
No, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it can't be, because like the parts in the world where one system is being implemented or another are being equally affected. Like hyper-capitalist countries are affected, communist countries are affected. Like turning to these sort of ideologies is obviously not the solution.
So maybe the solution, Damien, is to start with a different nomenclature. And to talk about capitalism with, the word I like is beauty, for example. But to you just get away from money and financial transaction and payments and this and that, and just use different type of nomenclature to think differently about this.
Different nomenclature, like the word beauty, like
the beauty is aesthetic in a sense of, in the artistic sense, not in the philosophical sense. Maybe just think differently about this. Think about using words from, I don't know, biology, from astrophysics, something different. Because if we still talk about government and healthcare systems and, you know, the funding of healthcare systems, it's, you know, undoubtedly will fall back into the typical hole, because it's really hard to get out of it if you're using the same words.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is almost kind of a question of like what exactly we want to be talking about, because coronavirus is, I mean, it's a global problem, so it has so many dimensions. Like on the one hand, there are just pure logistical problems. Like we do need, I don't know, better healthcare systems. I don't know if we can imagine a replacement of a healthcare system that's so novel we can't recognize it. Like
no, that's not what I mean, but I'm saying that, for example, let's just say we start the article by saying what we want to build, or what we, you know, eventually what we think is needed is a beautiful social system. Not as a balance, not as an equitable, but we just say beautiful. And then we start defining what we mean by beautiful. Just to think differently.
No, I like that. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, because it's counterintuitive. I don't even know how we would go about that. Or maybe even, yeah.
We can start a discussion like this next week, saying what we think is really important is we have a beautiful social system or civilization, or whatever we want to call it. What does that mean?
Excellent.
That would actually be unique, you know.
That would be unique, yeah, and probably less relative than we think.
Oh, I think it's going to be. Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very. You know, it's going to actually. What does it mean, beautiful, in terms of agency, for example? What does it mean in terms of health? What does it mean in terms of social justice? And what does it mean in terms of, you know, comfort?
Right.
Physical comfort, right? The ability to buy stuff and have some sort of, you know, a dignified life.
Right. Okay, so let's start there. I think that's a great prompt. I like the format of the paper, so I'll add that to the little expectation list. And are we meeting in a week, next Tuesday?
Yeah. I'll send a Zoom. Always seems to be a couple of problems when I send Zoom requests, but we always seem to be able to pull out of it.
Yeah,
we have a potluck tomorrow. You know that, right?
Yes, at noon, right?
Right.
Excellent. Yeah.
Maybe we can also think of drafting a couple of people from because the summer's cohort will be invited.
Excellent. The summer cohort is starting via Zoom, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we want to keep
that's another, you know, opportunity right there.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do. It's going to be interesting. Maybe try to pull Christian back into the group, because he's interesting.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll send him a note.
Great. All right,
Olivier. I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah.
Take care, Tim. Thanks
Great,
again.
great.
Bye.
Great as always. Ciao.
Ciao.